But truth is not pigmented or gendered. Right. Truth is whether a statement corresponds to reality. And knowledge is where you can justify a truth claim by evidence and argument. That's just the way it is. That's pigment neutral, that's gender neutral, that's age neutral.
Hey guys, I'm Bill Westers, and this is the Encountering Truth podcast. Welcome to the Encountering Truth podcast, where we examine the evidence for Christianity, engage culture with kindness and conviction, and encounter Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. Well, we have my friend Dr. Doug Groothuis with us again, and as we mentioned last time, Doug is a professor of philosophy and apologetics at Cornerstone University. He's the author of many books and even more articles, and he is the host of the Truth Tribe podcast. So thanks for joining us again, Doug.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, in our last episode, we talked a lot about apologetics in general and the importance of apologetics and worldview. We hit on some key points about the various arguments for the existence of God. And so if you haven't watched or listened to that episode yet, I encourage you to go back and check that out. There's a lot of great information and great wisdom that we just had in that discussion. But we ended that episode talking about the role of apologetics as it comes to social and cultural issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, critical race theory. Well, Dr. Groothuis has actually written a book where he talks about some of these issues, and the book is called Fire in the Streets: How You Can Confidently Respond to Incendiary Cultural Topics. And so, Doug, tell us about that book and why you chose to write it in the first place.
Yes, well, it was the summer of 2020, and the George Floyd riots were happening around the country. And my wife, Kathleen, and I were actually in rural Alaska for the summer, and things were getting so violent and protracted with this that we really wondered if we should move back to Denver, where I was teaching at the time, or whether we should maybe stay a year in Alaska where we felt safe. Now, that's a pretty crazy thing, to wonder if you should even return to suburban Denver because you're worried about your own safety because of riots. And, of course, this was occasioned by the death of George Floyd, and then in the wake of that was the idea that America is systemically racist. It has to be metaphorically or even literally in some ways burned down. So many places were burned. One of the things that really stunned me was something on National Public Radio. They had an author who had written a book called In Defense of Looting. And the author was saying that you can loot because if somebody has something you don't have, and it's a corporation that has lots of money, they haven't earned it. They've basically stolen it. So it's fine to loot it. It's a Marxist or neo-Marxist perspective that if you have any discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, to use the old Sal Alinsky phrase, the haves and the have-nots, then it's intrinsically unjust, is based on an unjust system, and you can commit violence and revolution in order to overturn it. And that kind of language was everywhere in 2020. Right. So people are asking me to do podcasts about this. Friends are calling me and saying, what's going on? What's the philosophy behind this? And I decided that I needed to write a book about it and try to explain the ideology behind it and try to give a constructive answer that you don't get from what's called critical race theory.
Right. Yeah. In the preface of that book, you talked about what you call the constrained vision versus an unconstrained vision of human nature. Can you explain what you mean by that and the difference between the two?
Right. That's very important for understanding politics and history. And I get that from Thomas Sowell in his book called A Conflict of Visions. He's an American economist and historian, 93 years old now. He just published a book a year or two ago. I've been reading him for 40 years. And he says that's probably his best book, and he's written about 40 or 50 books. So what he says is that you have two essential visions of society. The unconstrained is whatever problems you find in society down through history are based on externalities. The wrong form of government, something went wrong because people are intrinsically good. And if you simply let them express themselves without hindrance, or if you create the right kind of government, then almost all of our problems will go away. So the apotheosis of this would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau's statement, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So we're born free, noble, creative, good, denies the fall that we learn from Scripture. And everywhere man is in chains. Why? Well, somehow the social systems have gone wrong. And you see this come through Marx and other thinkers. Now, the constrained vision is that human beings are intrinsically flawed, limited, and selfish. And so society can only expect so much from beings like that. We don't expect a heaven on earth.
Right.
We don't expect a utopia.
Right.
So this is essentially the conservative view that we find ultimately rooted in Scripture and in thinkers like Edmund Burke and more recently Russell Kirk or William F. Buckley or Thomas Sowell himself. So the unconstrained vision is untrue because while we are great, because we're made in God's image and likeness, we're fallen and we need redemption. And civil government is not about ushering in a utopia. Civil government can restrain evil to a degree, provide penalties. Romans 13, 1 through 7 deals with this. But we cannot expect heaven on earth. And all the ideologies that have tried to create heaven on earth through revolution, particularly Marxism.
Nature's fallen, and so we
Yeah.
can't expect a utopia.
You cannot. So it's constrained, but it's realistic, and it's actually way more positive and constructive than the unconstrained vision, because the unconstrained vision is assuming a falsehood about human nature and then thinking if humans are really angels, then we can just let their beauty and their wisdom and their goodness just unfold. Well, we're not angels.
Yeah, and then you put that trust in their hands, and then what do they do with that? You know, it
Right.
kinda
Right.
ends up a lot.
Well, the
worse
way it
off.
always works out is some kind of totalitarian civil government. So we see this with Marxism, Marxist-Leninism. You see that with the Bolsheviks' revolution in Russia. You see it later with Mao Zedong taking over China, making it into a form of Marxism, and Pol Pot with Cambodia. And what happens? In the 20th century, perhaps 100 million people were killed by their own governments because they would not conform. They didn't see that utopia was dawning. They were resisting the state. So this unconstrained vision through Marxist-Leninism or Marxist-Maoism does not view human beings as having intrinsic human rights. It's atheistic, believes religion is the enemy. Religion is based on a way of just trying to pacify people, to not work for revolution. That was Marx's view. Religion is the opium of the masses. So there's no fear of God. There's no God. And there's no sense that human beings are limited. The idea is if we just change the fundamental structures, we get rid of private property and the profit motive, we can actually even eliminate the division of labor, which is just intrinsic to creation. So what I try to do in the book when I look at critical race theory is say, let's look at the big picture here in terms of what's called philosophical anthropology, which means who are we as human beings? And your philosophical anthropology will determine, by and large, your politics. And the constrained vision is a biblical vision. It's not only held by Christians, but also by some non-Christians, commonsensically, looking at history. So the constrained vision is a much more historically grounded, realistic account of our life together. The unconstrained vision appeals to our desire for perfection, for endless betterment. And the people that hold this view just spin out one theory after another, one promise after another, but they ultimately can't deliver on them. And actually, the critical race theory perspective is rooted in Marxism. It's a type of neo-Marxism. And it says that if you find discrepancies of achievement in society, that's based on something in the system. It's not ultimately a question of individual responsibility. There's something in the system, because if you just give people the right system, everybody will achieve and flourish, and things will work out very well. So it's not just Marxism classically understood. It's what's called cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism. And the big shift here, although it's still the unconstrained vision, is to say that we don't just look at economic categories like the owners oppressing the workers. We also consider especially racial categories. So the white race has subjected and marginalized people of color. That is the main determining factor, not economics per se. Now, it's still neo-Marxist. They're still wanting to redistribute wealth and create a society where there's really very little discrepancy between what people make and what people own and things like that. It's a socialist vision, certainly. But instead of saying, the evil capitalists, it's the evil white capitalists who are also heterosexual and Christian. Right. So there's an intersectionality of oppression and of oppressor. So the intersectionality of oppressed is if you are a person of color, sexual minority, meaning someone who's not heterosexual, then you are doubly oppressed, let's say. You are an African American lesbian. So you're African American, you're oppressed as part of a group. You're lesbian, you're oppressed as part of a group. And if you're a male and you're white and you're heterosexual, then you're part of the power class, the oppressor class, and you're, in that case, triply bad. And the black lesbian is doubly oppressed. And those are the categories you have to think in terms of. And the idea is that the oppressor class has unfairly somehow taken away rights and opportunities and wealth from those who are oppressed. And the categories are very dualistic. It's like oppressor, oppressed. And they're very simplistic and very reductionistic. And when you consider the social science of discrepant achievement in society, there are a lot of reasons for that. 100 years ago in America, race would be a very significant factor.
Sure, yeah.
Because you would have Jim Crow laws and segregation was in place. But even then, many blacks achieved a lot in a segregated setting because they were excluded from so many white areas and white institutions. So in many cases, they created their own and did very well in those areas. That doesn't mean that there was anything good about Jim Crow and that kind of segregation.
Right.
It's not. So what I try to do in the book is isolate the roots of critical race theory in Marxism, show how it is too dichotomistic, oppressor, oppressed. It's reductionistic. We view everything through the lens of race. And also, it's terrible social science because there are so many reasons why, let's say Nigerians achieve very high levels in the United States. They're black, obviously. They're Nigerians. You look at income, education, they do very well. Why is that? It can't be because they're black. It's because of their values.
Oh, yeah.
And all right, some blacks in the U.S., African Americans, when you look at them as a group, you find indications of pathology, fatherlessness, lack of education, criminality. There are a lot of reasons for that.
It doesn't just come down to
it doesn't just come down to color of skin and the fact that people are discriminating against you. Right. I mean, Thomas Sowell has made this point for so long. even if you're in a culture that discriminates against you because of your color, it doesn't mean you have to fail in that society. And the example that he gave that I read 40 years ago, and he gives lots of examples, is the Chinese. When the Chinese leave China and go elsewhere, they typically succeed educationally and financially because of their work ethic and their family concerns, even where they're hated, even where they're hated. And a black conservative like Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center, who was involved in the civil rights movement and is still encouraging blacks to develop themselves, build up their communities, that kind of thing, will say things like, we blacks can still achieve if we put our mind to it, even if we are discriminated against. He said, I'm less worried about you discriminating against me than I am about me taking the opportunities I have with education and working hard and things like that. But the critical race perspective identifies real problems, but doesn't understand the cause of the problems, and then gives terrible supposed solutions, which is essentially socialism, statism, redistributing wealth, not by class, but actually by race. And we're seeing this in the Biden administration. They are specifically making funds and programs available to black people first, above other people. Now, you might say, well, why not help economically disadvantaged people in some way? Think of Appalachia. It's white.
Sure.
People suffer from multi-generational poverty and drug abuse and all kinds of problems. We're thinking about that more now with J.D. Vance as the vice presidential candidate. He wrote a book, 2016, called Hillbilly Elegy. And there are white folks, the nasty word is white trash, in Appalachia that have suffered terribly for generations, drug abuse, criminality, everything else. And you want to say, okay, well, here's somebody living in a rented trailer, to use all stereotypes, who hasn't worked, who's on unemployment or something like that, and doesn't even get good medical care, but it's a white, male, heterosexual. That person is somehow oppressing people of color just by virtue of being a white heterosexual. This is what's called white privilege. What kind of white privilege does a white trash person have? And I'm using these words in air quotes, basically. I'm not using it as an epithet.
Of course.
I'm just, you got to be careful with language. People accuse you of the craziest things.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm kind of running with the ball that you handed me here.
That's all right.
But I don't take critical race theory to be an accurate understanding of human nature. It's certainly incompatible with a Christian worldview. And one of the things that concerns me terribly about critical race theory is that it's deeply un-American. The idea is that America was built on slavery. That's the thesis of this 1619 project that came out. That America is not based on any founding ideals that are worth emulating and worth conserving, like the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that a lot of our founding documents are in themselves like racist documents, or our founders owned slaves,
Right.
And the things like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, where black people were considered only 3/5 of a person. You address that in your book, so continue on with that and tell us.
Right. Well, certainly slavery existed in America at its founding. Not all the colonies or later states were friendly to slavery. Some were, some weren't.
Right.
Okay, the South certainly was, and that generated the Civil War, right? But let's look at the Declaration of Independence, which was principally authored by Thomas Jefferson. It's really a magnificent document. It's a declaration to the world why we are declaring our independence from Britain and what our basis for this is. And the appeal is to human rights that come from God, that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So endowed by our Creator. It doesn't come from the state. It doesn't come from a social contract. It comes from God. And all men are created equal. All right, Thomas Jefferson wrote that. He had slaves. The whole thing's a sham. Oh, I got so excited to hit the microphone. The whole thing's a sham. No. The question is that true? And we know from Scripture that is true. We're all made in the image and likeness of God. Genesis 1, Genesis 5, Genesis 9. We know that. Now, the language of image of God is not used in the text, but it's really informed by that understanding. Mm-hmm. Jefferson was an inconsistent man. He had kind of a vexed relationship to slavery. He was not a model. But is it possible to write better than you live? And someone like Martin Luther King, and I point this out in the book, the great civil rights reformer, appealed to the Declaration and appealed to the Constitution. He called them magnificent documents.
Right.
But he said, we've come to cash a check. That is, we have not, as African Americans, been well served by these documents. We're in a process of trying to live up to our founding creed. Mm-hmm. That's the view that we should take. It's not the whole thing was wrong from the beginning, start over again, torch the whole thing with some cultural Marxism, redistributing wealth, statism, guaranteeing outcomes, targeting people by race for special privileges. That is not the way to address these kind of problems we have.
Right. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. So, in the book, okay, and some of this theory, you bring up this idea of standpoint theory, standpoint epistemology, and so where basically the voices of the marginalized are the ones that are supposedly the ones that hold the truth. Now, they might ask you, Doug, you being a white, male, heterosexual Christian, who are you to talk about this stuff? Can you address that? What would you say?
The short version is, I'm only as good as my arguments, and you're only as good as your arguments, whatever your skin color is. But the deeper answer is, well, before I get to it, let me give you an anecdote. Sure. I won't give any details, but I heard from a friend that he was in a setting where someone brought up my book, Fire in the Streets. And someone in that setting said, we won't read Groothuis's book on critical race theory because he's white, which is a form of literary racism. We won't look at the arguments, the footnotes, the qualifications, the primary source research. He's white, so we don't have to think about it. Why? Well, he's privileged. He's one of the oppressors. His view is jauntist. So this is part of, as you said, standpoint epistemology, and the appeal is often made to lived experience. Right. So the lived experience of African Americans or Hispanic Americans should determine our outlook about race in America and what should be done to make America a more just place. And this is an interesting permutation or morphing of postmodernism. Because postmodernism, I wrote about this in my book, Truth Decay, said there's no objective truth. Everything is a matter of perspective and frameworks and paradigms. But you can't really get to the objective reality of anything. You just have takes on reality. However, we need to be suspicious of meta-narratives like Christianity, because these big stories of reality that claim to be objectively true have marginalized people, supposedly. And we should listen to those people that have been marginalized, like third world people, people of color, and so on. Now, fast forward 20 years, the idea is that the supposedly oppressed people throughout history now have purchase and ownership of objective truth, and you cannot challenge anything that they say. Right. Now, what do we do with this? Well, everyone has a perspective. And I have no idea what it's like to be an African American man in America, or an Asian American man, or a trans man in America. I have no idea because I'm not any one of those
Right.
things. But truth is not pigmented or gendered.
Right.
Truth is whether a statement corresponds to reality. And knowledge is where you can justify a truth claim by evidence and argument. That's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's pigment neutral, that's gender neutral, that's age neutral. So if I want to understand something about what it's like to be an African American man in America, then I need to listen to African American men because I don't know. In fact, around 2020, I started interacting with a lot of my African, or several of my African American friends, and said, have you ever been pulled over by the police, you think, just because you were black without any reason? And some said yes, some said no. So I wanted to add that to my knowledge base. But lived experience is not going to tell you the meaning of the Declaration of Independence or what the 3/5 clause, which we'll get to in a minute, of the Constitution means. It will tell you how you have experienced life from your subjective vantage point. It doesn't make you an expert on American history, economics, political science, or theories of justice.
Right.
It doesn't. So that's what concerns me, is when standpoint epistemology serves as a substitute for a rigorous intellectual argument.
Yeah.
So, well, people of color get to decide what's real because they've been oppressed. Well, okay, maybe they have been oppressed in various ways. It doesn't mean their perspective is true. They might
Right.
be off on that. For example, I don't have any of the statistics in front of me, but if you ask a lot of people what has happened in policing in the last 10 years with respect to white policemen killing unarmed black men, a lot of people answer, oh, it's happened thousands of times. It happens all the time. It's so terrible. It's so horrible. It's actually extremely rare. But it's just in the zeitgeist, the
perception.
spirit of the perception. And then it could be that certain African Americans have been mistreated by the police unfairly. And then they sort of project that out broadly. But as I said, truth is not pigmented, and truth is not gendered, and truth is not a matter of whether you're Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, or whatever you are. It's correspondence to reality, and knowledge is justified true belief. So let me go to the 3/5 clause, which I talk about in the book. People say, how can you have such a high view of America as I do, at least in our founding ideals, with the Declaration, which we touched on, and then also the Constitution, because the Constitution says that African Americans are only 3/5 human. It doesn't say that. When you look into it, it had to do with the North and the South making a compromise to have a constitution at all. All right? And the North wanted to restrict the representation for voting in Congress because the South wanted to count all the slaves as part of their population, which would give them more representatives in Congress. Right. And of course, none of the slaves can vote, and none of the representatives are going to be black. So the North said, no, we don't want to give you a 1-for-1 for representation. We'll give you 3/5. It was a way to compromise, and it was sad. It had to happen. It was a compromise that was made in order to have a constitution at all.
Yeah. So
the Constitution says nothing about slavery, nothing about race. It's the Southern Constitution, the alternative that was created against the North that mentions race explicitly and explicitly limits the rights of African Americans. So, yeah.
So essentially, the South, if they were able to count all their slaves who they wouldn't allow to vote anyways, then they would have had a much higher representation and could have prolonged their agenda even longer. And so in a sense, there's the seeds of abolition were kind of within the Constitution itself.
I call it a time bomb.
Yeah.
The 3/5 clause was actually a time bomb against slavery. And I'm really grateful because many, many years ago, I read an article in Commentary Magazine on this in 1987. It's my principal source that I give in the book because I have heard this over and over again
Right.
for decades. And it's like a take it for granted truth.
Hmm.
Uh, I did a lot of work on the New Age movement many, many years ago. And one of those take it for granted statements that was not true was, well, the Bible used to teach reincarnation and the church fathers took it out. I would find that in every other New Age book I'd read. They
Wow.
just throw it out there. So I thought, that can't be true. I'm going to do the research on it.
Right.
And in my book, I think it was in Confronting the New Age. Yeah, I really take that on. And it's just not the case.
Hmm.
But if you repeat something enough, if it has an emotional pull,
Yeah.
and if you want the soundbite and the factoid and the vibe, as opposed to the research, it may seem convincing to you, but it's just not true.
Right. Yeah. And in chapter 8 of your book, talking about the CRT, you were saying that, and you kind of briefly mentioned some of this before, but is inasmuch as CRT denies the correspondence view of truth, it becomes incoherent. Since it presents itself as true and worthy of belief, it takes non-CRT views to be false and unworthy of belief. And you say that CRT advocates collapse knowledge into racial and gendered perspectives and even claim that rationality is thus conditioned. And if so, we lose any hopes of adjudicating truth claims through appeals to reason and evidence. There could be no public square for rational discussion. But then you say that Christianity offers a better way. So,
Mm-hmm.
so first of all, one of the things you were talking earlier about this idea of truth and correspondence to reality, and one of the things I've heard people say is this idea of rationality, reason. They would even chalk it up to something like whiteness, and that lived
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
becomes more important than
Mm-hmm.
actual true rationality and reason. Can you go into that a little bit, and then go right ahead into what is this better way that Christianity offers?
Mm-hmm. Well, some people that advocate critical race theory or wokeness, as we often call it, will say that the very idea of objective truth or universal rationality, these ideas are ideas that perpetuate white supremacy. So that's just a white thing. The idea of objective truth, truth that's out there, irrespective of our perspective of it, or rationality, that there are right and wrong ways to reason about reality. Those are just part of the white, hegemonic, privileged perspective. And I have some quotes in the book because people might think, really? Are you making this up? Is this like a straw man argument? Do people really believe this and say this? They do.
Mm-hmm.
They do. In fact, I don't think I have this in the book, but I was listening to National Public Radio a few years ago, and someone said the idea of objective truth is racist. I thought, okay, let's just do a little analysis on this, right? It took me like half a nanosecond to do this. The idea of objective truth is racist. Well, that's a claim about objective truth.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a claim about the way things are. So if objective truth, the very concept, is racist, then now you're a racist by claiming it's racist. I mean, it's absurd. It's just absurd. And when I look at great African American heroes that fought for rights and gained a voice to be heard, think of someone like Frederick
Mm-hmm.
Douglass. Frederick Douglass taught himself how to read. He became a marvelous writer and orator. Or think of Martin Luther King, his ability to write and his ability as an orator. They didn't say, oh, being concerned with grammar and syntax and the right words and logic and trying to get to the objective truth is white. We're going to junk all that
Hmm.
and we'll just do it, what, the black way? What does that even mean?
Right.
That's not the way to advance, and it's just illogical. When people start talking about objective truth as a white idea, they can't maintain it for very long because they're going to be making objective truth claims all the time,
Right.
in spite of themselves. And when people say that basic forms of rationality are somehow corrupted by whiteness, they will still, in spite of themselves, try to give rational arguments. Maybe they won't do very well, but they'll still try to give rational arguments, or they'll try to use rationality against your viewpoint. But I give an example in the book. This idea can even strike at very high levels of the academy. There was a writer named Derek Bell, who was something of an influence on Barack Obama. He was an African American law professor and legal scholar. And towards the end of his life, he pretty much gave up on giving reason and evidence to support his views. And he started writing stories and condemning the whole enterprise of reason and evidence is basically commandeered and controlled by whites to their own ends. And I have quotes to that effect in the book. In fact, he created this short story called The Space Invaders. And it was made into a made-for-television movie like 40 years ago. And the basic thesis is that these aliens come to Earth and they say, you have a lot of problems with pollution and overpopulation, and if you give us all the black people, we'll solve your problems. And this somehow goes to a vote. This, I guess, is only for America. This goes to a vote, and the vote is, yeah, take all the black people away so we can have a better world without black people. And I thought, how implausible, incredible, and crazy is this story? But he made it up to try to show at some imaginative level that America is systemically racist, that whites really want to get rid of blacks. If they could eliminate blacks, they would, if it would be in their own self-interest. And Bell thought that whites only give privileges to blacks when it somehow helps the whites. He called it the interest convergence principle. You know, such a jaded, negative view. And there's so many counterexamples to it of the many white people that joined the civil rights movement and sacrificed and struggled. I mean, think of all the white casualties in the Civil War. Right. So I'm not a big fan of Derek Bell.
Yeah, so he made up a story, a fictional story,
Yeah.
and basically applied it to reality, saying this is what people would actually do in real life without any actual.
Right. Now, he did do a lot of legal scholarship in his career. It's not that he didn't engage those realms. He did. And maybe some of his work early on made some good points here and there. But he got more and more radical, and he got more and more into this racializing rationality, racializing truth. And it really ends up being a kind of collective ad hominem against white people, that they have so rigged the game and made it unfair for blacks that we won't play by these rules anymore. And I don't think that's the way forward. I think the way forward is essentially the Martin Luther King vision of a colorblind society. Let merit determine who advances, give people as many opportunities as possible, but neither promote nor demote people based on race.
Yeah, and there's a lot of Christians, unfortunately, that get caught up in some of this language, especially kind of, I think, deceives Christians when it comes to some of the critical theories, critical race theory, and I've heard it put that our compassion is weaponized against us because no Christian wants to be considered racist, and so they join this. They adopt the critical theories and the mindset of that. But you mentioned earlier that it's an unbiblical worldview. Can you go into that more? And what is the proper Christian approach to this?
Well, I think we have to start with the story of creation, that God made human beings, male and female, in his image and likeness. And there is, from a biblical viewpoint, one race, the human race. And we are all equal before God in terms of our essential worth as human beings. And it's wrong to discriminate against people purely because of their race or their sex. But we do need to make judgments about merit and value. And I think we need to do that fairly with people. And the whole affirmative action project and now diversity, equity, inclusion basically dismisses merit and puts race at the center. So people are given positions or promoted because of race, not because of competence, or the standards are lowered. And this is really very offensive. It should be offensive to people of color that, well, you can't compete at the level with whites and Asians, so we'll lower the level so you can get in or you can get a job. Thomas Sowell wrote about this so many years ago, and he said one thing that affirmative action does is it creates suspicion. Are you my doctor because you're a good physician, or are you there because you're Hispanic or African American or something else? Are you a pilot because you're excellent at flying planes, or because there was a DEI quota that you filled?
Right.
I mean, this is not good for social interaction, for trust, and so on. And the biblical view is the great leveler. We're all made in the image of God. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And we're all fallen. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And we all need to be redeemed. And we should treat people fairly on the basis of merit and mercy. Merit and mercy, not artificial categories of, well, we need this percentage of African Americans, this percentage of Hispanic Americans, this percentage. Why don't we try to make an even playing field, give people opportunities, have the rule of law, and let people achieve according to their abilities and not artificially promote or demote people. I think that view makes a lot more sense. And a lot of the problems that happen in certain ethnic groups and also achievements are not because of discrimination or racism, but because of the values of the groups. And the example that I give is Barack Obama, not known for being conservative in any sense, but when he was running for president, he said the major problem, and of course he's African American, half African American, the main problem is fatherlessness.
Yeah.
And I have a long quote. It takes up, I think, about a whole page in my book from Barack Obama saying, let's face the fact that the reason for increased criminality, lack of education, all these other problems, drug abuse, is more than anything the breakup of the African American family and fatherlessness.
Right.
Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Charles Murray, been saying that for 40, 50 years.
Right.
That is the essential problem. And how do you address that? Moral reform, biblical values on sexuality, restraint, saving sexual intimacy for marriage, staying married, keeping a job. There's a woman, you might have heard of her, named Star Parker. She was on welfare for years. She had multiple children out of wedlock. And I think in the 70s or 80s, she became a Christian, and she reformed her life, and she became politically conservative. And her mission is really to help people in these disadvantaged areas rise up out of the poverty and out of the dysfunction. And she says, if you will stay in school, get a job, keep a job, get married, and stay married, you will basically not live a life of crime. You will not be a drug addict, etc. But what is this? Discipline, restraint.
Right.
And you can throw money at people all day and all night, and if they don't have a sense of discipline and restraint and a concern for the nuclear family and some respect for the moral order or the fear of God, you can throw all the money you want, and it won't do very much good.
Right. Yeah, it's important to be honest, to look at truth and to speak the truth, even though sometimes that's not what people want to hear. But you even said in your book, you said speaking the truth in love. You say truth without love is harsh, and love without truth, you say, is mute and mushy. And so I love that. And then you kind of summarize some things towards the end of your book, and when you say that we should, playing off the title "Fire in the Streets," that we should fight fire with fire, but articulating the difference between fighting bad fire with good fire. What does that mean? What would that look
Yeah.
like?
Well, I'm talking about Christians participating more wisely and avidly in society, and of course opposing these critical race theory ideas and policies and laws and politicians. They're not going to bring about any good for America. And I try to make that case, but I say we need to fight bad fire with good fire or holy fire. So that means, I think, prayer, repentance, pray for renewal, revival in America. And then also remember the good that God has given to America through our founders, our founding ideals, our ability to self-reform, to more closely approximate the American ideals of all men are created equal, and so on. And I give some principles for that in terms of limited government, the importance of being a responsible citizen, of teaching civics, of teaching children what America is, what the founding principles are, what are the three branches of government, what is the Constitution. One thing, I don't go into this, I don't think, in the book, but why do we have an electoral college? A lot of people don't understand that.
Right.
It's very significant. It's part of the whole American founding. It makes perfectly good sense. We're not a pure democracy.
Right.
We were never meant to be. It's a republic. What is a republic? So, for one thing, Christian parents can make sure their children certainly know the Lord, know the Bible, are catechized, and that they know their country. They know the history of their country, the principles of their country, so they can spot the falsehood.
Right.
They can spot the critical race theory ideas or the older Marxist ideas and say, that's not biblical, that's not American, and there's a better way. I mean, something as simple as, why do we celebrate the 4th of July? What happened?
Right.
Why did America declare independence? What's in the Declaration of Independence? Right. Is it true? And if the Declaration is true, that we're created equal and given inalienable rights, well, then what else has to be true, right? We have to live in a theistic universe.
Right.
We have to understand
where do rights come from.
Where do rights come from? Not from the civil government. They come from God, and a just civil government will recognize those rights that are God-given, but will not try to create rights or take away rights autonomously. So
to secure the rights.
Yeah, secure the rights that are already there, because if rights are simply created by the state ex nihilo, they can create and destroy anything they want.
Yeah.
And that's the story of Marxism in the 20th century.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much for joining us again.
You're welcome.
I look forward to having us on, having you back on here. Is there anything that you're working on that you would want to tell us about, or anything in particular that you might want to recommend for us?
Well, I'm always working on a variety of projects, writing projects. I'm working on a book now called What If Jesus Was Right, that looks at his claims, all of his major claims, and I show that he was right in what he claimed, and so if he was, we should follow him. We're kind of wrangling about what the final version of that book will be, but I hope that book will come out within a year. And I'm working on a book called 40 Urban Legends About Apologetics for B&H Academic. They have a series in this.
Okay.
One of them is called 40 Urban Legends About Theology, 40 Urban Legends About Church History. So I'm going to be looking at false ideas about apologetics that hinder the church getting involved in defending the faith. And a number of other projects. I'm very excited to start this fall at Cornerstone University, where I'll be a distinguished professor. So I'll be teaching 2 undergrad classes, Introduction to Philosophy, and also a seminary class on apologetics and ethics. And I'll be advising the faculty on teaching everything from a Christian worldview, which I'm very excited about, and will be representing the school nationally through my teaching and writing. So it took something that good to move me out of a place I lived for 31 years with 300 boxes of
Oh,
books,
wow. Yeah.
which you helped me
Yeah,
unpack.
that's right.
And there's still more work to do. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll enlist your support again.
Anytime. Yeah.
So lots to do. And I am just on fire for the Lord in terms of my gifts. And I want to use my gifts as a teacher and mentor and writer as best I can to promote the Christian cause for as long as I can.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And tell us again where we can find you and follow you and all that.
Yes, I have a webpage called douglasgroothuis.com. I have a podcast called Truth Tribe. It's put out by Life Audio. I'm also on X and Facebook. My personal Facebook page is maxed out usually at 5,000, but there's also a public figure Facebook page.
Sure.
But I have a pretty open policy with Facebook, so even if you're not officially a Facebook friend, you can post and see what's going on there. And I'd give links to articles that I've done, podcasts that I've done. In fact, today I went on and I said, I taught so many classes at Denver Seminary for so many years, and I may not teach some of those classes. So I have syllabi on all kinds of subjects like Blaise Pascal, C.S. Lewis, cultural apologetics. If you'd like any of these syllabi, just email me and I'll send you the syllabi. Wow. So there's a lot of intellectual activity that goes on my Facebook page. And I also post cute dog videos once in a while, especially my dog.
All right. Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks again for joining us. And thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. Give us a good rating or review wherever you listen and share it with your friends. Follow us on Facebook. Visit our website, encounteringtruth.org. And remember, let's make it our goal to examine the evidence, engage culture, and encounter Jesus. God bless. We'll see you next time.